want to start my talk by emphasizing something which I never did, even a few months back, that we start 2022 by not discussing whether energy transition, decarbonization, and net zero has to be done or not. It's given now. The commitment that India made at Glasgow last year of reaching net zero by 2070, and I'll come back to that 2070 deadline, as well as of the midterm target by 2030 of decarbonizing the economy, meeting 50% of our electricity or energy. That is still not clarified, but 50% of our energy requirement from renewable, reducing the emission intensity of our economy. This announcement at Glasgow now means that we start 2022 by discussing how best to do it, not whether to do it or not. So this entire debate that we used to have in this country, and 2021 was extremely interesting because there was a whole lot of discussion with whether India should announce net zero target or not. I'm happy that that discussion is over, and we are now discussing on how best to achieve these targets so that we have a net positive social, economic, and environmental outcome. Now, it is quite clear to me that this transition is not going to be a painless transition. And it is also clear to me, in many cases, if we do not plan well, this transition is not going to be a positive transition. It could be a net negative transition, whether in social field, economic field, or environmental field. Therefore, the emphasis that we should now start talking about, how do we achieve a net positive social, economic, and environmental outcome from this imminent transition that is taking place. Just a few days back, the hydrogen policy was announced. This is the beginning, because I believe that there's a lot more thing that we can do with hydrogen. I think the policy is a good beginning, but it needs to be strengthened going ahead. We already have, in a way, electric vehicle policy. There is performance-linked incentives to battery technology. Renewable energy has got incentives and promotion because it is now economically in the past, but now it is quite capable of competing alone. So from a technology perspective, I think we have made great strides in the last few years. Where we have not made great stride is from management perspective. All these things that we are talking about, whether it is renewable energy, hydrogen, battery, electric vehicle, industrial decarbonization, is also incumbent on some of the key reforms that India needs, which we are quite scared to take. Let me give you the example of one major reform to the distribution companies. Now, so far, distribution company issue has been dealt by central government scheme. We have gone through, series over the last 2-3 decades, series of, debt waiver and various kind of things that central government has done to ensure that distribution company reforms happen. But we are at a juncture in electricity sector in India that if we do not do massive reform in distribution companies, then the target we have set, for example, for reaching 50% renewable electricity and beyond, will become impossible. Simply because investors are not going to invest money in India when the prospect of return and risk, the risk outweighs return significantly. And that was also always there, but maybe manageable. But as the numbers keep increasing, the impact of distribution companies as a bottleneck, that perception is also going to increase. So some of the major reforms in policy is required to accelerate the technological technology that is coming into the country and the technology promotion scheme that a government is launching. So personally, I am quite convinced and quite confident from technology perspective that technology will come. Once technology comes, it is economically viable, private sector will get in. You can see how Reliance, Tata's, Mahindra's, all the private sector are so confident about renewable technology, electric vehicle, batteries and others, because the technology has reached a stage where it makes sense to invest and make money. That story is now becoming more and more clear. But there's a social story which is not becoming clear. Now, one of the implications of this energy transition is that India's energy geography will change. The map of India's energy geography will actually move from Eastern and Central India to Western and Southern India. And you can see that happening already. Today, Central and Eastern India provides us with 80 to 85% of our coal production. There's some amount of coal that is produced in Southern India and Western India. But renewable energy is being installed in Western and Southern India. Now, this has implications on federalism that we need to understand, because where we have coal today are also our poorest districts and poorest states. Whether you take Jharkhand, Orissa, Chhattisgarh, Madhya Pradesh, these are the states, and in them the districts are even more economically backward. From Dhanbad to Chatra to Singrauli, who are the energy powerhouse of India today. But the energy transition demands that these coal mines close down. The thermal power plants are phased out. But what alternatives we will be able to provide them? Because today, say 7 to 10% of revenue receipt of these states are dependent on coal. I'm just talking about revenue. But in these districts, these are mono-industry districts where the GDP of these districts are maybe 60, 70% of the GDP is dependent on coal in some of these districts. These districts don't have anything other than coal. So I think while we are discussing the techno-economic aspect of transition, we are not discussing the socio-economic, in many ways, political economy of that transition. And that worries me a little bit, because if techno-economic moves at a very fast pace and political economy is not catching up, you have conflict. And that is one of the main reasons why conflict always happens on technological transition. That technology is moving at a much faster pace than political economy. And in this case, I'm not talking about mobile phone. In this case, I'm talking about 25 districts which are completely dependent, but close to 50 districts where the implications are very, very high for jobs and growth in Central and Eastern India. You're talking about 50 members of the parliament. And you can think about state assembly. And maybe about 100 million people who are dependent on coal. So one big issue of this green transformation, which is underway, is that how do we manage the political economy of this transition by ensuring that these districts and states are on board and are being provided alternatives. And therefore, this entire discussion on just transition, which is picking up across the world. Countries like US are now realizing that if they do not handle the political economy of this transition, then this transition will face far more difficulty than what they had thought before. In our case, we have not even started thinking about it, what the political economic fallout is going to be. Last week, we released a report on Korba. Korba is the largest coal producing district in India. And I had on the panel, Dr. Saab, Mr. T.S. Singh Dev, who is the health minister and Panchayati Raj minister of Chhattisgarh on the panel to talk about it. And his entire speech focused on justice. And he said that the freight equalization policy, which provided coal at the same price across India, meant that Eastern and Central India never got industrialized. We only remained a resource extraction part of the country because national development was so important. But now, with the transition happening, so we suffered, and our tribals suffered, and forests suffered when the coal extraction happened and mines were open, and we are going to suffer when these things are going to close down now. So his entire speech was on the justice element of transition, and I think it is an important issue that we should be discussing. As I said, the transition should not happen in a way that the poorer part of the country become even more poorer. I think that is an important issue that we all need to consider. The second point is finance. And Gagan is on this panel, and I'm sure he will touch upon the issue of finance and from where it should come. But let me say that the climate finance debate in India is still a debate which was fine in 20th century, not in 21st century. What I mean to say is that today we have an extremely capable private sector, or as well as domestic resources, who will be able to attract foreign capital and raise capital domestically. So India of 2020 is not India of even 2000. We are a much more financially capable country as far as raising transition finance is concerned. The second point is that India now sits on high table. We are part of G20 with aspiration to be on the Security Council. Now, when you are at high table, you do not get grant. Neither you should expect grant. So this entire discussion that happens on climate finance, that India is a poor developing country, we are victim of climate change, and developed countries should give us public grant, I don't think it's going to materialize now. So one, our expectation on what kind of money we need for climate finance needs to be moderated and refined. As far as, so what kind of money India will get? India will get investments. And therefore, the entire climate finance in India should be about how do we get investment which is at a reasonable cost. Because today, if you are a vulnerable country, you are viewed as a risky investment and the cost of capital is high. This is a dichotomy in global climate debate, that the victim of climate change actually ends up
I think we have lost Mr. Chandra Bhushan. We'll wait for a minute for him to join back.
I think I'm sorry, there was.
No problem. Please continue.
So let me come back to the finance point, and I'm going to end with this, that a discussion on change in global financial architecture is important now for countries like India to get investment, climate investment, which is reasonable, which does not victimize us, because we are now more vulnerable to climate change. And as the impact of climate change is going to become more and more visible, and it will, we will be viewed as more risky investments. So one is that I think India's entire focus on climate finance now should be how do we reform global financial architecture? That's an important issue of discussion that should happen, and we should, and within that, how should we get investment to build our energy transition capital? And the capital requirement is going to be very high. Prime Minister talked about $1 trillion at Glasgow. I think that $1 trillion is only required for renewable energy transition. It is not, the kind of money that we will require for adaptation, loss and damage, just transition, building a climate resilient infrastructure is going to be even more higher. I don't think there is any estimate on that number. Many people have given some number on how much resources will be required for net zero and others, but those are largely technology transition number. These are not the amount of resources that will be required for investment in coal region or in building resilient infrastructure. So our requirement for money is going to be very, very high. And that we can get at a reasonable rate and in a predictable manner if there is a discussion on global financial architecture. Let me end by bringing the issue of how we should as a country deal with climate. And I'm more focusing on the institutional aspect of climate action and energy and just transition. Currently, everything is centered in Delhi. Union government negotiates, union government puts out India's commitment. It is within the constitutional right, within our constitution for union government to do it. But the fact is, the kind of climate action that will be required will have to be done by state and local body. And I'm so happy that recently I heard a few of the state ministers, Mrs. Sangma from Meghalaya, I think Mr. Thackeray from Maharashtra and others, talking about the need for a institutional setup for climate action and how do we move ahead. I think there is time now for India to think about a climate legislation and an institutional setup, a federal setup with very clear responsibility at district and state level to implement climate change. Because so far, frankly, things have happened on an auto mode. Renewable energy has come because of certain government policy, but frankly, private sector has found space in it and has run with it. And I'm sure so will happen with hydrogen. But the complicated political economy issue that is going to emerge, I don't think central government can handle without having a really strong institutional structure. Just for example, if there are 2 thermal power plants of same capacity and same vintage in 2 states, then who should close first? I'm just throwing a question in front of all of you. Okay. Which thermal power plant should close first and on what basis? Now, these are kind of federal questions that will come. We'll have to set up principle on which this transition will happen. And these are, just the kind of question that will hit us in next 4 to 5 years. But to answer these questions 5 years hence, we must start preparing now. And this is what I think has to be the discussion in the country. And as I started by saying, I'm delighted that we are not discussing whether we should do it or not. Now we are discussing how we should do it. So thank you very much. And I'm really so happy to be part of this panel. And I look forward to the discussion.